Go ahead, Alyssa, handing it to you. Happy Wednesday afternoon to folks, and welcome to what we like to call Webinar Wednesdays here at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. We are waiting for our room to populate as we get started here. I want to thank you all for joining us for our second in our environmental justice series. We'll be talking about local perspectives on updating the general plan environmental justice element. And I'm joined by a very esteemed panel that I will introduce to you very shortly. So thank you all for being here. We'll wait just a couple more minutes as folks populate the Zoom room. This is Webinar Wednesdays at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. I'm William Walker, and we thank you for being here today. I think it's a good time to get started. Again, I'm William Walker, and on behalf of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, we'd like to welcome you to our Webinar Wednesday presentation on environmental justice, local perspectives on updating the general plan. My name is William Walker. I'm Associate Planner with the Planning and Community Development team at OPR. I'm joined by my co-moderator and colleague, Erik, who is our Program Manager at OPR's Planning and Community Development team. Hi, Erik.
Good morning, or I should say good day.
All right. We have a great panel here for you. And before I turn it over to Erik, I would like to introduce you to each of them. Arlin Benavides is our graduate CivicSpark fellow with the local government commission. It's a partner agency of ours here at OPR, and he most recently completed his fellowship with Tulare County and is here to talk about that experience and his work on EJ issues. Welcome, Arlin. I also am joined by Tiffany Yang, who is the Green Zones Program Manager with the California Environmental Justice Alliance. I'd like to welcome you. Good morning, or good afternoon, Tiffany. And finally, but not least, Joseph Lambert. He is the Development Services Director with the City of Placentia down in Southern California. Welcome to you, Joe.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So I would like to hand it over to my colleague, Erik, who will welcome us all here to Webinar Wednesday. Again, he is our program manager for the Planning and Community Development team at OPR. Good afternoon, Erik.
Thanks, William. Welcome everyone to our second webinar of this year focused on environmental justice. And welcome back to repeat attendees who were actually at our last webinar. And for those of you that missed the last webinar in July, that information is archived on OPR's YouTube channel. So I know we'll be sharing links to that momentarily. So if you missed that, the first webinar that we did in July this year was focused on our new guidance around incorporating environmental justice into the general plan, implementing SB 1000. So we don't plan to do a deep dive on our guidance today. Actually, the reason why we have all these amazing panelists here is because on the last webinar, as we were closing, one of the things we asked you, our participants, was what would you like to hear the most at a future webinar on environmental justice? And the overwhelming majority said they wanted to hear from folks that are doing this work on the ground in local communities, working on advocating for environmental justice, working with disadvantaged communities, planners, stakeholders on making this work through the planning process and implementing it on the ground. So that's really the focus of the webinar today, is to focus on the story. So I'm really excited for William, all the hard work you've done of getting this panel together. Thank you, panelists, for being here. We're excited to hear your stories. I'm only going to spend 5 minutes or so setting us up just to get everyone on the same page again. If you're new to California or you're new to SB 1000 environmental justice, just a very short overview here before we hear from our great panelists. So William, if you want to go to the next slide, I'll dive in. So in California, and for several decades, we've had environmental justice in state law. And so what I'm going to show you on the slides now is just a basic framing of how we define environmental justice in California at a pretty high level. And this applies to planning, but it also applies to a lot of the different policies and laws and regulations that are in effect in California today. And the formal definition, as shown in written in government code, is environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of people of all races, cultures, incomes, and national origins with respect to the development, adoption, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So a pretty long sentence full of all really important concepts in there. And if you go to the next slide, William, the definition doesn't stop at that one sentence. There's actually some articulation of what this can include. And you'll notice that there's 4 main points, A through D here. Of course, the healthy environment for all people is a very core concept that frames equity and puts equity in really at the forefront of environmental justice. But also it gets more specific than that. It talks about the deterrence, reduction, and elimination of pollution burdens. So the pollution burden aspect is top and foremost in the state definition as well for populations and communities experiencing adverse effects of pollutions, so that the effects are not disproportionately borne by populations and communities. So really important concept there. The next really important point is that governmental entities engaging in providing technical assistance to populations and communities most impacted by pollution to promote their meaningful participation in all phases of the environmental, and here we go, really important word, land use decision-making process. So in state law, outside of SB 1000, we have an important point that really frames EJ as being critical, not just to our environmental environment and regulatory, but in planning. And then last but not least, at minimum, the meaningful consideration of recommendations from populations and communities most impacted by pollution into environmental and again, land use decisions. So again, all of what I highlighted today is actually not in SB 1000. It's been in state law for a few decades. And so just wanted folks to be aware of that this has been part of our DNA for a long time. And we're now just getting through SB 1000 into making it a more central part of what must occur in planning. And of course, SB 1000 did just pass into law 4 years ago and became effective in 2018. So having it be a mandatory part of planning and not just in principle is what we're really talking about today. So next slide, William. So SB 1000 now into effect, and what we've done on this slide is sort of boiled down all the basic requirements in the bill that have transformed the planning and zoning requirements on what you must do to incorporate environmental justice into the general plan. So the first big step is sort of that screening step, sort of normalizing and figuring out what's required in law, what are your options for defining disadvantaged communities. How do you know if you have disadvantaged communities in your jurisdiction? That is one of the legal litmus tests of what EJ is required and what jurisdiction and how you would address it. The other one is the timing or triggering provision, which is, are you updating 2 or more general plan elements concurrently? Of course, local governments can address environmental justice at any time in any of their planning or policy making, and the state definitely encourages that. But in terms of what the basic standard is for when it's time to do it and when you must do it, these are really the 2 triggering questions under step 1. And so we have a lot of guidance in our new document, which we won't have time to get into detail today. The second phase in the process is really about, once you've defined who you're planning for in your jurisdiction, who is disadvantaged, and you are in the phases where you're doing a comprehensive or a somewhat comprehensive update, looking at least 2 or more elements concurrently, you then begin to frame goals, policies, actionable programs that address the needs of disadvantaged community in light of the disproportionate health or pollution burdens they may be experiencing. So We have 8 bullet points on the screen that these come straight out of the statute in terms of what's basically required. And again, our guidance gives a lot of granularity and specificity about what this could mean and how you might address these issues in light of the data you're gathering, in light of the outreach you're doing with local communities. Next slide, please, William. Well, maybe go back one. We think we skipped over. One of the most important parts of the guidance, and that we continue to get a lot of questions about, we could do a whole webinar on this one actually, is really understanding how disadvantaged communities are defined, at least in the law, and then what the options are for local planning agencies to really define and engage with disadvantaged communities. So there's an important screening process. We don't have time to unpack this fully today, again, because we want to get to our panelists, but just know that in the new guidance that there's a multi-step process that OPR recommends that's consistent with what's in the law in SB 1000 about using a several different screening criteria for really understanding from a data-driven perspective how you might identify who's disadvantages for the purposes of planning. And that includes the use of a pretty well-known tool in California called the CalEnviroScreen tool. It's an index tool that looks at a lot of different data sets around population characteristics and environmental data about what's happening on the ground and what historically has led up to conditions that have led some communities to bear disproportionate burdens. The other criteria have to do with mapping sort of what we call low income areas, and there's some legal definitions, and you can use those geographies as well in combination with local data on health and pollution burden. And then that wavy yellow line that we'd like to talk about at OPR is super important because this is where you connect community outreach, community engagement with the kind of technical screening process, the conversations of hearing from communities of color, underserved communities, disadvantaged communities, and some of their historical or even current experiences around their lived experiences, as well as what health conditions exist and the inequitable access to goods, services, and the conditions that other less, more well-to-do parts of communities may be advantaged in ways that other communities are not. So this is where that conversation really takes place and leads communities up to the point of really determining who are we planning for and how do we engage disadvantaged communities in the process moving forward. So that's really what the screening process is all about. Again, we'd love to dive into the details, but we're going to save that for another time. And the last point I'd like to make, next slide, and the final point I'll make, based on what I just said, that civic engagement process is so important, not just in the screening process, but throughout the planning process. And of course, OPR's broader general plan guidelines speak a pretty high level of detail about how integrated civic engagement is critical to effective general plan updates in California, but we do have a section in the new environmental justice guidance as well that really emphasizing how critical this is to having a successful environmental justice element development and implementation once the general plan update is complete. We like to see folks looking at civic engagement, not just during the planning process itself, but in implementation and monitoring of the effectiveness of that general plan, and really putting communities all across the spectrum of the local agencies, but definitely incorporating disadvantaged communities and keeping them engaged throughout the process, including implementation. So with that, I'm going to wrap up my remarks. Thanks again for everyone for being here today. I really look forward to hearing some of the stories and lessons learned on the ground and how that can connect with what OPR is promoting today. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Eric. And I do want to say thank you to everyone who's joined us. I realize I didn't let you all know there are more than 400 people joining us about this critical issue. So I'm very happy to see that you're all here. And we're gonna have our first interactive portion of this meeting. It's our poll. And we wanna look at who's in the room today. And I'm gonna hand it to my wonderful special assistant and tech producer, Alyssa Montanez, to lead us through our poll. Good afternoon, Alyssa.
I was muted, sorry.
No worries. Zoom life, right?
Yeah. I'm gonna go ahead and launch the first poll for everybody. Perfect.
All right. So again, thank you for joining us today. We want to know a group below. We want you to choose from a group below on your screen that best describes you, whether you're a community advocate, someone who's In the trenches in the community, you might be a planner where you might have been tasked with working on an EJ element. You might be a state planner or policymaker working with a state agency. Maybe you're a consultant in a private firm, or just an individual that's interested in environmental justice. And if one of those doesn't apply to you, you can choose other. So we'll give you a moment. That poll should have popped right up on your screen. And we will give it a little bit longer to populate.
Looks like we're at 85%.
All right, that sounds good. Why don't we go ahead and give the results? I cannot see the results. Oh, now I can see the results. Thank you, Alyssa. Looks like the vast majority of folks joining us today are planners. A lot of private sector consultants also as well, followed by state agency and individual or advocate. So thank you for participating in the poll. All right. I'd like to hand it over to Arlin Benavides. He is our graduate CivicSpark fellow. He spent his year-long fellowship working in Tulare County on environmental justice, specifically engaging community members in developing the EJ element. So I'd like to, without further ado, hand it over to Arlin.
Thanks, Will. This is so exciting to be on this platform and to be able to share my experiences with you all. I never thought I would receive a big audience of 443 members. That's amazing. But as Will mentioned, I was a CivicSpark fellow during the 2019-2020 year, and I worked with Tulare County Resource Management Agency. And the reason why OPR today has invited me to speak with you all today is because I wanted to share my experiences. We know that during this pandemic and as natural disasters ravaged through the state, some of the strategies or the ways that you previously conducted community engagement might not longer be feasible or be implementable. And so what I want to offer you all is some strategies or tools, questions that you can all be very mindful about as you're conducting community outreach in communities, so that you make sure that you're maximizing your connection, making meaningful relationships with community residents, understanding their stories and how you can connect them to the process that you're engaging in as you're developing your EJ element, and how to make sure that they're collaborating with you and your agency in the process that you have undertaken to do your element. So because I have limited time with you all, I just wanted to dive in. So Will, if you want to go to the next slide. So the way I'm going to offer these questions for all of you guys to be mindful about is through a series of stories. And I would like to begin my story with telling you all that on one Saturday noon, I was driving up to a disadvantaged community on the northeast side of Tulare County. And I was panicking, I was very anxious, I was afraid. People told me not to go alone to this place, that there was a lot of violence, a lot of crime there. But I think one of the points I really want to make is that the point of community outreach is to engage with community residents. Is that not true? We want to make sure that we access them at times that they're available and when they will be home. So I was conducting my outreach usually after work in the evenings or on weekends when I knew that families were attending their household chores or just lounging around. And the first person I spoke to, the community that I arrived to, his name was Edwin. And I started talking to him about some of the challenges and needs that I had heard existed in this community. But I wanted to hear his story. I wanted to hear what he does, what his thoughts were, if he had any arguments or solutions that he wanted to let me know about, because I would be writing some of the sections that could definitely inform the county about situations that were happening in his community, but also create policies, right, that could ameliorate some of those challenges. Edwin told me that he had been in the country for no more than a few months and that he worked in agriculture. However, he was not really interested in discussing any of these topics because he was not really aware of anything that was taking place. He didn't know much about planning processes or practices, and he wasn't in the community for too much long to know anything about that he can really contribute. So the first question I really want to give you guys all, something that we should all be asking ourselves, Will, if you want to press the space button, is how does each community resident fit in the context of the community? If you're reaching out to residents and they have not been in that community for too long, they might not be as invested in the community to talk to you about some of the solutions that they have thought about. If they have not spent too much time in that community, they might not also be have knowledge about how that community has changed over time, how the adverse effects are changing both them and their neighbors. And so I think it's really valuable to understand also how they're connecting with their neighbors and other community groups in their community, because you definitely want to know how they're interacting so that you can gain their trust and then in turn gain other people's trust. The next story I really want to share with you guys is the story of Iris. Iris is the household owner of the household where Edwin lived. And Iris was very suspicious of me when she drove up to the driveway, because as anyone in a disadvantaged community, if they see someone with a clipboard and semi-casually well-dressed, they're thinking it's danger, right? So we also want to be mindful of that. But I spoke to Iris about what the challenges and needs that I had spoken with Edwin about. And Iris immediately released an abundant amount of passion and vulnerability and just the mentality around working with youth. She told me that she had worked with youth that were involved in violence and crime and drug use. She had allocated a tremendous amount of resources for women who were involved in domestic violence. She had been working with the Department of Interior, and she wanted to pursue law to bring about really essential changes to her community. So the next question I want to pose to you all that you should all be thinking about as well is, how does the citizen's story align with the topic areas you're addressing in your EJ element? I think this is a great question for all of you to be thinking about, because as you're developing the table of contents of your EJ element and getting to know what you really need to address and the policies that you need to look at, you also need to be making sure how the community residents that you're interacting with can contribute to that. You want to make sure that their topics are aligning with their stories. And if their stories are aligning with the topics that you're going to be talking about, how can they share their stories so that your sections are well informed? The other question, Will, is what are citizens most passionate about and how much are they willing to contribute? Iris was crying by the time I left our conversation. And she had mentioned that she really wanted an opportunity to attend meetings at the county level to share her stories, to share her concerns, and to really voice the opinions of her and her community members. And so she was really passionate, and she was also willing to speak. I think we'll often confront community members that will either want to speak with us while we're standing in front of them, just having a one-on-one conversation and feel most comfortable then. But other people really want to get to the top, right? And they really want to talk to who is going to make the most change for them in their communities. And others are just very curious and they just want to hear about the process and learn as they go. And so they might not want to listen. They just want to listen in, but not really say much. Which leads me to my next story. I was, as I turned around the block after a few conversations after Iris, I saw that there was 3 girls and 2 of them were sitting at a table painting. The other one was washing dishes out at an outdoor sink outside of the mobile home. And I was immediately touched with emotion because I questioned if this was something that was happening all the time. Were they washing dishes outside of their home because they didn't have a sink inside their home? Did they not have potable water? What other resources did this family lack that I could maybe address or talk to them about that could really inform my research? And also just wanting to make meaningful connections. I ended up talking to the mother of those children, and her name was Carmen, and Carmen had recently been laid off of her job. She worked at a center for health and had tremendous amount of experience with doing outreach, working with communities, allocating resources, but she was laid off because of budget cuts. Carmen was available and willing to join meetings at the county level and to share her story and to contribute as much as she could. However, she did not feel comfortable joining Zoom meetings or talking immediately. She just wanted to participate and listen and hear how things were going and hear about the progress of the EJ element. So I think this is another important component that we should all be mindful about. Just because we don't have everyone in the community that wants to engage in our activities immediately or in our meetings does not mean they're not willing to listen and participate. And so we also need to be mindful of this last question that I want to pose to you guys all. Will, what mode of communication do they feel most comfortable with? I think this is really important because you're not always going to have people in your community that want to engage through meeting forums. Some of them might want to engage in other ways. And so just analyzing or assessing how the community members that you're engaging with in your community want to communicate will be an essential tool for you guys all to make those meaningful connections and lasting connections to be able to have a very strong network of people you're working with on the development of your EJ element. Next slide. So lastly, I just want to go over some strategies. We don't have too much time. I would love to share all the strategies we ended up working on at Tulare County. First one, Will, I just want to say that it's really important if you can, whether you apply for grants or you want to set some funds apart from your general plan fund, to have create opportunities that pay community residents that are working with you. They are the experts of their community. They have seen the changes that have happened over time. And you definitely want to show your appreciation for them because, like Carmen, who could possibly be doing outreach work with us, we want to make sure that she's compensated for that time and for her efforts. Next. Establish an EJ advisory committee. This was a monumental change that Tulare County implemented while they were developing their EJ element. We invited local government agencies, community-based organizations, and they're also willing to invite community residents. And I think it's very important to have a platform where all of these three parties can really interact, ask questions, and stay informed of the updates that are taking place in your jurisdiction. Next point. Create social and digital pathways for community participation. This is really important because, like I already mentioned, not everyone's going to want to participate at a meeting setting. Some people might want to just listen over the phone. Some people might not want to show their face. But I think it's really important to also access a wide group of folks. You want to but you want to connect with younger youth. You want to connect with adults and with older adults. And a way that you can create this is by having your community events, having your activities outside with physical distancing, of course, but also seek Facebook pages like community groups, community council groups, school districts, schools that are next to disadvantaged communities where you can disseminate information like newsletters or some executive summaries about each section, just to make sure that the communities are staying informed about what you're doing. And also they have various ways of communicating with you. You'll get a lot of feedback on social media. Next point. And the last one I really want to mention is that I know it's very difficult for us to implement all of the civic engagement activities to satisfy all of legislation requirements. And so having an ombudsman, someone who would be responsible for making sure that the civic engagement activities are executed, that they're answering questions, that they're keeping up and keeping those relationships, maintaining those relationships with everyone that you've come in contact with, is a really important step that you might want to take, or your jurisdiction, if you have the flexibility and finances to do so. Also, maybe just assigning, if you're not able to have an ombudsman, maybe having a planner that specifically is in charge of some of those responsibilities would be a great way to work on that. Lastly, I just want to, we don't have time right now for your Q&A, but I really want to encourage you guys all to contact me if you have any questions about your work that you're doing in your jurisdiction. I'd be happy to support you. And if you want to quickly take a photo also of Nick Johnson's, he's a current fellow at Tulare County if you want to reach out to him. Thank you all.
That was a great presentation, Arlin. I do want to say that this slide deck will be available shortly after the presentation to folks by our website. And if if you want that deck a little sooner, you can also send an email. We'll provide our email a little bit later on. So thank you so much. There are about 500,000 stories like Edwin's and Iris's and Carmen's and Tulare County. And Tulare County is one of more than 500 different stories that we tell here in California. We keep using this word jurisdiction, which if you're a nerdy planner type, you know what that means. But if you're not a nerdy planner type, it's a city, it's a county. It could just be a community that may not be in a city or county. It's how we define a particular area that we try to provide the supports to in California to have access to the resources that folks need to have a high quality life. And the reason I talk about many jurisdictions is Arlin's story is one of many, and I'd like to hand it to Tiffany Ng, who is a program manager with the California Environmental Justice Alliance, who works with tons of different communities throughout the state to help inform them about environmental justice issues and how to really get the types of services that one might need in order to develop a plan that takes care of the needs that may not be met. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it to Tiffany and to thank you for joining us this afternoon. Hi, Tiffany.
Hi, thanks, Will, for that introduction. And so for those of you out there who are unfamiliar with CEJA, or the California Environmental Justice Alliance, CEJA is a statewide community-led alliance that works to achieve environmental justice by advancing policy solutions. Our member organizations work in partnership with EJ community residents from the Bay Area to the LA and San Diego region, and from the Central Coast to the Central Valley and the Inland Valley. CEJA was a co-sponsor of SB 1000 alongside the Center for Community Action and Environmental Justice, or CCAJ, back in 2016. And we worked in 2018 with PlaceWorks to develop the SB 1000 implementation toolkit so that planners, local government agencies, community members, organizations, and other stakeholders could have guidance on how to best implement the law, especially from an EJ perspective. So today I'll be talking briefly about the purpose and intent behind SB 1000, as well as some best practices and challenges that we've seen during implementation of the law since it first began in 2018. And so next, why SB 1000? Well, to begin, the law is something that seeks to provide a way for cities and counties to begin addressing historic inequities in planning that have led to poor health outcomes for certain neighborhoods and residents. The law was inspired by the work of local resident leaders and community-based organizations such as the Environmental Health Coalition in National City, as well as CCAJ in the Inland Valley, Inland Empire region, that advocated for the creation of the first EJ elements for the cities of National City and Jurupa Valley, respectively. The law recognizes that there have been various policies over time, such as redlining, restrictive covenants, and discriminatory lending practices that have led to the unequal development patterns that we see today within cities, such as segregated housing in schools, a lack of economic opportunities for certain neighborhoods, and concentrated poverty and pollution, and much more. And as many people know, this is due to several factors, such as poor land use decisions and inappropriate zoning, discrimination in planning decisions and land use decisions, power imbalances that have denied certain communities from having a voice or seat at the table when it comes to important decisions that affect their lives. And, there's been times in which certain jurisdictions have prioritized the interests and needs of corporations and businesses over the health and well-being of local residents. So next, you can see this really clearly. Oh, sorry. Thank you. When you take a look at, residential security maps or these redlining maps of the 1930s and 50s, in which certain communities, those being predominantly communities of color and low-income communities, were overwhelmingly denied access to home loans. And if you compare this map, this is of Stockton, if you compare this map to the state of California's CalEnviroScreen map that measures cumulative environmental and socioeconomic burdens at the census tract level, you can see how old housing and planning policies have led to certain communities becoming the dumping grounds for polluting and toxic land uses, while other neighborhoods that have more wealth and specifically, wider communities tended to have received more public resources and investments, greater protections, and thus, as a result, tend to have better health on average. Next. One of the most frequently asked questions that we've received regarding S1000 is, what are some good examples of how cities or counties have been implementing S1000? Like, who is doing a really good job? And while we definitely understand the importance of, looking at good models and good cities and counties, we'd also like to lift up that many jurisdictions don't have to look always to other models, because EJ has been a part of planning for a long time, or for a significant amount of time. We know that jurisdictions have done this in different ways, such as, doing health and all policies work, doing EJ goals and plans in climate action plans, or in specific plans. There's been ways in which, local governments have addressed equity and social justice in, different plan decisions. So I think there's many existing models that we can look to, but there's also many ways in which this has already been happening for a good amount of time. So next, and while we recognize that, S1000 is still in its early stages of implementation, SEH has observed a number of positive changes and benefits that the law has achieved so far. There has been definitely greater awareness, education, and training on how to incorporate EJ into planning and general plans by local governments. There's been stories of how some planners said, I've never heard of this term EJ or environmental justice, who are definitely more versed in what EJ is now. There has definitely been more increased collaboration with the public and EJ communities by local governments. And so some folks who are working at S1000 have created community advisory boards or committees that have different stakeholders, from the residents to business leaders, to guide S1000 development and update the process. We've also seen jurisdictions improving their communication and coordination and collaboration with community-led, or community-based organizations. And we've also seen jurisdictions even partner with local groups to apply for grant funding opportunities. So there's been definitely a lot of benefits to this process, while we're still waiting to see the results of all these plans that are coming down the pipeline. Lastly, I think, it's really cool to see jurisdictions that have few to no disadvantaged communities really wanting to do this work, because they know that there's pockets of disadvantage within their jurisdiction. And they're saying, hey, we know that certain residents are not given as many benefits and protections as others. How can we work to address this through work on SB 1000? So yeah, it's been great to see the inspiring work that's happening across the state. While there's definitely lots of room for improvement and ways to make this a better process, we want to just highlight the work that has been done through SB 1000 so far. One thing that has come up a lot during implementation is the issue of how to ensure meaningful community involvement. And as Erik mentioned, this has been something that's been explicitly added to the definition of EJ for the state of California. But community involvement and community engagement has not been new to EJ or any kind of equity work. We have, as I mentioned before, a toolkit that we did in partnership with Placeworks to really lift up some best practices and work on how to engage communities in a meaningful way through S1000. So if you want to learn more about that, I definitely would like to reference that toolkit. And I believe it's chapter 4 in particular. So one thing that we want to note is that it's really important to, dedicate sufficient time and funding to this work. I think it's really important to make sure that venues are accessible and are near transit, so people, well, I know this is pre-COVID, but you have accessibility for your meetings and your processes. It's important to make a sufficient time and space to get people's feedback and to gather appropriate data to inform your plan. And other things like making sure that meeting materials, food is available, translation is available, are also, of course, very necessary for these kinds of community engagement processes. And next. I think one thing to lift up is that, there's definitely been some challenges with community engagement For instance, there have been some jurisdictions who do S1000 who want to engage the public at the very end of the plan's development. So we don't feel like this is quite the spirit and intent of S1000. We think that's important to integrate community input from the very beginning of the plan's development, not at the end. We also think it's very critical to reflect community members' ideas and feedback in the final plan. I think there's ways in which people go through the motions of doing like public engagement and commenting, but then when it comes to the final plan, sometimes all that really important input and research is not reflected in the final plan, which kind of goes against the whole purpose of having community engagement processes. So yeah, I think there's definitely ways to make the community engagement and feedback stronger, whether it's advisory committees or even like consulting and contracting with community-based groups. And if folks have questions, again, we'll share the toolkit link at the end. In addition, knowing that we are dealing with the COVID pandemic at this time, it's even more critical to ensure that there's meaningful and high quality community engagement, because many residents lack the technology, resources, and tools to engage in these important decisions that really affect their health and future opportunities. And so I wanted to lift up this letter that was written by Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. They wrote this to the legislature to make sure that residents could have a space to give comments and feedback to bills that were being proposed, given the fact that there's so many barriers for their participation and that people cannot go to the Capitol. So some things I wanted to lift up, which I think are very relevant for S1000 work, is the importance of clearly notifying the public of all meeting times with very detailed information on how to be engaged, the need to reach out to residents early on to make sure they're informed about the different ways and channels to engage in the process, making sure that there's ample time to submit comments. Sometimes the comment period could be very rushed. So if there's more time to really spend on submitting comments in different ways, that's excellent. During meetings, if they are, webinars or online or on, using phone, it's really important to make sure there's two-way communication so that people are not just listening to information, they're actually able to participate and give feedback during the conversation. And that this, these methods are in multiple languages, are spoken by local residents. So there's many different things that you can do during COVID to make things accessible. And I think one thing to also think about is whether or not this is the right time to engage in a public process. You can also reach out to CBOs or other groups, churches, schools, et cetera, to talk to people and ask them, is this the best time to work on this process? Or is there a better time to push this forward? So really minding what are the local needs when it comes to S1000 implementation. Next. Again, we've also heard a number of questions by jurisdictions regarding how to best identify disadvantaged communities through the SB1000 process. And while the law does mention, the need to use CalVirus Screen, and we think that CalVirus Screen, of course, is a very important tool, it's critical to the work on EJ. We know that it's also one of various tools that can be used to identify disadvantaged communities. So for instance, there are existing tools and data sets, data from local air districts or water boards, and especially data from local residents and community-based organizations that can be layered on top of CalVirus Screen to create composite maps of disadvantaged communities that can more accurately depict EJ communities at the city or county level. So on the screen, you'll see a number of tools like EGSM, EJ Screen, Backman's Care Program, the Healthy Places Index, CalAdapt, and others that can be used to be more, create those more intricate and accurate disadvantaged community maps. Lastly, I wanted to highlight the need to create actionable plans. And I know it's hard because, they're general plans or extensive projects. And we also recognize that we don't want these to be paper exercises. There's a number of ways to make plans more actionable, which are lifted up in OPR's general plan guidelines that I want to mention, such as the ways in which, plans can use stronger language, such as, using words like provide and require that are more directive than weaker language, such as encourage or where feasible, which are more ambiguous and don't require certain kinds of protections. The importance of creating implementation plans for your work, and the ways in which general plans, and especially SB1000 in particular, can create action steps and deadlines to address health and disparities in needs. And so Lastly, we also want to mention the fact that while the law doesn't say this currently, we do think it's implied that there should be periodic updates of the EJ elements or EJ goals and policies, so that they're not just things that stay there forever, but are updated as more information and data is observed over time. And so, yeah, I mean, there's much more we can say about S1000, but I hope to leave you with a couple of tools. Like one is our S1000 toolkit, which you can see on the screen. And last but not least, my email. So if anyone has any questions, you're welcome to contact me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. And we will provide this link at the very end of our webinar. I know that we're limited on time, but wanted to get to our final presenter. And when I think about the city of Placentia, you don't always think that the AG is going to write a letter about little old Placentia. A lot of you may not have heard of it. It's a smaller suburb in Orange County, and their general plan environmental justice element is very nicely written. And without further ado, without elaborating, gushing over it, I will just hand it over to Joseph Lambert, who is the Director of Development Services for the City of Placentia. Welcome.
Hi, thank you, William, and good afternoon, everybody. As William said, I'm Joe Lambert. I'm Director of Development Services here in City of Placentia. You may think Placentia would be an unlikely city to address environmental justice. I would agree with you, especially a couple of years ago. We're in North Orange County. It's a relatively conservative community. However, we do have our areas with disadvantaged communities, and I did not know that until we ran the Cal EnviroScreen process. When we started this process, I was actually not prepared to address environmental justice. In fact, personally, I had heard about it, but I was not really 100% familiar with all the state's guidance on it. So just a little bit of background. Here in Placentia, our entire general plan had not been comprehensively updated since the 1970s. That being said, several elements had been updated. For instance, the housing element. Back in 2014, our city council adopted a state certified housing element. So in general, we were in compliance with state law, but we hadn't taken a comprehensive look at the whole general plan for upwards of 40 years. And I came here in 2016, and I do have experience. I worked on a general plan update in the city of Yucaipa before I got here, and we did use a big firm, Placeworks, and it was a great process, and can't say enough about it. It was a very comprehensive process, and it's a great general plan in Yucaipa. That was prior to the state's guidance on environmental justice. Here in Placentia, by the time I got here in 2016, the city had started and stopped updating the general plan probably at least 3 times, maybe more. And so it just couldn't get across the finish line. And in fact, it really didn't even get started. Will, can we put up that first slide, if you don't mind? Or
I
if we
I
can,
will
that's
try
okay.
to share again. So I thought it
Oh,
was
that's
up.
okay.
And looks like
That's
it wasn't
okay.
up.
That's fine. I'll just keep going. Though, so in our new general plan, we had there's several. All those bullet points are just a few of the topics that were addressed comprehensively in the updated general plan. And what I started to realize throughout this process was really just how much overlap there is between the elements. I mean, that is obvious, but what I started to realize, and I'll wrap this up later, is that what turned out to be our health, wellness, and environmental justice element was one of 2 elements, including our sustainability element, which really relates to every other element of the general plan. So, and also just to be clear, I think one great lesson for everyone out there is that we tried to write our element regarding environmental justice in such a way that it gives some priority to environmental justice goals over some other goals in the general plan. And next slide, if you can. Thank you. Just briefly, in updating Placentia's general plan, I don't want to get too off track with the rest of the general plan, but it was very important to our city to address economic development. That is really our main revenue source here in the city. Sales tax, property tax, hotel tax, for instance. So we addressed economic development. We also addressed sustainability, and this is really the other element in our general plan that references every other element in the general plan. And although it's not a required element, it does touch on certain topics that are required, like greenhouse gas reduction and so forth. And so I listed there health, wellness, and environmental justice, and I'll get to that in the next slide. Thank you. To be honest, I really wasn't, like I said, I wasn't expecting to address environmental justice. However, once we relaunched the general plan update in late 2017, early 2018, when we started again in earnest, I realized with the help of our consultant, Jennifer Davis of High Peaks Planning, that we must. And as we've learned in this webinar, the reason for that, as shown on this slide, is that our jurisdiction has 2 disadvantaged communities listed there in the bullet points. So I had, there were several other items that we realized we had to address in our new general plan. As we know, there's, it is not unusual for the state to require more and more topics to be addressed. So therefore, I had to go to City Council with an augmented contract for our consultant. And I described, our general plan is also, I would consider it a medium to low budget general plan. There was a lot of staff work that went into it. Our consultants did a great job, but we really had to kind of cobble together the funding for it. So I'm not coming to you from a place of a city that had a huge budget for the general plan, but we made it happen anyway. And the thing that really made it palatable was I was interested in addressing health and wellness. So therefore, in asking for a little bit extra funding to address environmental justice, what really made it palatable to our city council and my city administrator was when I explained that, well, here, we have an opportunity here to address an optional topic, health and wellness, and wrap it up with environmental justice. And by the way, really do a service for our residents, for our community, and actually for the surrounding region. So next slide, Will. Thank you. This is just a map showing, the 2 census tracts in our city, which are DACs, disadvantaged communities. A lot of it has to do with proximity to a freeway and rail lines and air quality and noise and so forth, and also other demographic considerations as well. And as you can see, just looking at the color of the map, it's concentrated in one corner of our city. And as the process went on and on, I started to realize really how important this is. In our case, addressing environmental justice, it's so much more important for these concentrated communities. It's important citywide, but as you can see, our city, I learned just how stratified our city can be in terms of disadvantaged communities, income inequalities, healthy food scarcity, so forth and so on. And next slide, if you can, Will. This just shows a breakdown of the census tracts into different blocks and some of the income numbers. So we're not talking about really that low of income here, to make it a disadvantaged community. And just a few things I want to touch on. Once we decided to write this element, of course, the outreach was key. We held 2 or 3 community meetings just focusing on environmental justice and health and wellness in the DACs. We happen to have our main community center is located in one of these DACs, and it's a busy place, and a lot of residents really rely on it. So we were able to have a couple community meetings. We offered transportation, free transportation to the meetings. We offered dinner. We offered free childcare, free dinner. And the 2 community meetings I'm really thinking about were held almost like a design charrette, where we just had large paper out on tables and people just wrote down their concerns. And, you know, most of the concerns were valid. Some of them might fit in a different element, or maybe they're, you know, for the safety element or for a different department. But there was a lesson to learn in all of the input that we received. We also really had great partnership with a nonprofit in the neighborhood, and it's called Lot 318. A woman named LEGACIES is the leader of Lot 318, and they are like a boots on the ground nonprofit in the community. They offer a Thanksgiving meal every Thanksgiving in the neighborhood, and they happen to have a street fair before or around the time we were having one of our community meetings, and I had some of my staff and consultants were out on the streets during the street fair on the weekend, handing out you know, notices for a community meeting, and also doing survey work, asking people questions, getting input that we can put into our element. So I just wanted to make that clear that we had a great partnership with a nonprofit. My consultant was very, very passionate. And again, that's High Peaks Planning, a small firm. But, you know, and if anyone wants contact information, please feel free to work through me and I can get that to you. And that's on the last slide here. I don't need to go over all these, but these are really the highlights of all of the topics that are addressed in our health, wellness, and environmental justice element. As you can see, it's really, to wrap it up, it would be promoting healthy overall lifestyles for the whole community, and seeing what we can do. Really, what I realized is there's so much you can do to use the other elements to help health, wellness, and environmental justice. For instance, if it's increasing transportation and mobility, you know, you can have goals and policies in your mobility or transportation element, and they all really work together. So I'll leave you with that. I know we're running out of time.
Great. I just want to thank you for that presentation. And I mean, what's really great about, if I could just make one observation, is that it really took the city of Placentia to say, this is what we deem as a disadvantaged community. And that was a question that came up in Q&A. There are more than 30 questions in Q&A, and we are at time. So I just do want to apologize for my time management abilities. But I do want to say that what's beautiful about this process is that it's from the stories and from the actual interviews and, you know, the perspectives from the community that really define, you know, how we grapple with the environmental justice issues in all of our different jurisdictions throughout the state. We do have a last poll that I'll ask, but before we get to that last poll, I'll put our additional resources up. These are some of the links and the thank yous to some of the folks that were a part of putting this all together for you this afternoon. And it's clear that an hour is never enough for our EJ issues. So we will do a better job about making sure that there's more time for Q&A, because on our last webinar as well, you know, we were pretty limited there. I will ask though, one question or one thread in a number of the questions that I see is, how do you measure success And I'm taking the privilege. If you have to leave at 1 o'clock, you should, you know, politely leave. But I'm hoping I can keep y'all till 1:05. You know, how do you measure success in an environmental justice element process? Is it through the stories of the folks participating? Is it through having a nice polished report? What is success in this process? And I'm not sure who would want to take that first. So I will choose Tiffany.
Okay. Yeah, this is a really great question. And I would love to look to also experts that do work on EJ issues and public health to see like how, you know, folks have been doing their measurements of like changes over time. But I think in the end, you know, the law does call out the need to reduce health disparities and improve health outcomes to reduce pollution exposure. So if there's ways in which you can show and create metrics to measure those differences and improvements in people's lives, you know, again, exposures is a big thing. Access is a big thing. Again, health rates, that I think will be a great start to trying to see how well S1000 is done.
Any other comments on what a successful EJ element process might look like?
If from my perspective, William, it would be if the usability of the element. Again, as Tiffany and Arlin, everyone has touched on, we don't want to create these plans just so they sit on the shelf. And I feel that, you know, I was very interested in making sure our element is not just, doesn't just talk a good game, that it's something we could actually implement or at least work toward implementing over time.
Great. I know that time is very short. I want to ask Alyssa if you could run that last poll so that we can determine what you all might want us to cover on the next webinar. These are some of the top choices from our previous poll on what you'd like to see in a future webinar, either diving deeper into the EJ guidance document, which is a part of our general plan guidelines. We could talk about the tools or data sets used to inform the EJ update and some of those metrics that could help make for a successful plan. That would be option number 2. Or finding a way to fund your EJ update and your implementation efforts around environmental justice. We've got 300 folks still with us, so I just want to thank you all for staying a bit past the bell, as they say in the school world. Remember school bells. And big shout out, I guess there are a number of students in the house that felt that they could not engage in that last poll. They were others. So big congratulations to folks who are in school and trying to learn about this work. What topic, Alyssa, do you think we will be covering? Looks like metrics and data edged out to the top. So hopefully we will continue this webinar series on that topic, as well as answering, we have now 46 questions in our queue. So we will do our best to, we have some questions from our previous webinar and this webinar. We may even just do a third webinar just to have folks do a Q&A round, just to have some folks doing this work, you know, sound off about how to have a successful EJ element. I want to go to my colleague, Erik, our program manager, to see if you have any final thoughts.
Well, I just, again, want to thank all of our panelists and thank you, William, for hosting us today. I really encourage all participants here to please send us an email at sb1000@opr.ca.gov if you have a specific question that you would like answered today. We don't have the capacity to turn around detailed responses to all webinar questions received, but we're happy to respond to individual inquiries if you feel like your question definitely needs an answer. So just please know that we're willing to work with you. I saw some asks for meetings or technical assistance. We're also happy to set that up and schedule that, as folks kind of need to have those conversations about how to interpret our guidance, your own unique situation in your community or clients you may have that you're working with. We're happy to set those up as well. engage in that. So, but thanks again, everyone, for being here today, and we look forward to future webinars on this topic.
Any 10-second last thoughts from our panelists? Like 10 seconds for real. Are you good?
Thank you all for attending.